That's good. That's good. Welcome to another episode of Saints and Sinners Unplugged. I'm Ken Jones, pastor of Glendale Baptist Church, joined by two of our regular three co-hosts. We have Pastor Jose Prado from Christ Family Church and Pastor David Menendez of Miami Baptist Church. Aldo is not with us today, but we will be continuing our conversation about the attributes of God and particularly the communicable attributes as they are reflected in the image bearer, the human image bearer. But before we do that, Jose, you've been away from us for a couple weeks. How are things?
Man, good to see you guys. Good to be here with you guys. And I was on vacation. Actually, I went to the convention, the SBC convention. But I took the long way there. So I drove there with my family.
Oh,
made
man,
a few stops.
I love driving cross country. I'm not as good at it as I used to be, but I love just taking the time to drive through the land.
We stopped in Tallahassee with some friends, and we stopped in North Georgia in the mountains for a while, and then we headed over to Nashville. And then on the way back, we stopped at Cocoa Beach. But, yeah, we just kind of made it a trip, but I'm glad to be here.
All right.
It's good to have you, Jose.
All right. Well, listen, we've been talking about the attributes of God, the incommunicable attributes. And by incommunicable, we mean those attributes that are uniquely His. And when I say His, they are equally shared within the Godhead. But those are uniquely, they belong uniquely to God, part of His essence, His essential being, and He does not share that essential glory with any of His creatures. But there are other attributes that He does share with His image bearers. In fact, part of what we mean by being the image bearers of God is a reflection of some of His attributes, not in totality or not in absolute purity or fullness as they are in Him, but they are reflected in us. So when we speak of the communicable attributes in humans that reflect something of the image of God, we begin with rationality and self-consciousness, sense of morality. Mm-hmm. What else would you include there?
Yeah, definitely rationality. Just to take that one, just to get started there. In reviewing that distinction between God and the creature. God is a rational being. That means that He has a mind, right?
Right.
Yeah. He has a reason, that He has a will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But God, in His rationality, is a knower, and also He is His act of knowing. So He is absolute perfection in being and act. Mm-hmm. And He's also the ultimate known object. So He knows Himself. So that is not like creatures, but we do draw from Him existence and being, and capacities are likewise to be rational, to have a mind and to have a will and to know.
Yeah, I think another one that's it's relationality.
Yeah.
So the fact that we are people that need relationships, right? Community. And obviously that is a communicable attribute. God is three and one. So he lives in community, right? So I think that's one.
Well, on that one, and I think we overlook that as being one, a communicated attribute from God, and two, part of our being in the image of God, that sense of relation and community. But in the first announcement of man being created, it says God created him. He says, let us create man in our own image. So male and female, He created them. Male, and then it says male and female, He created him.
Yeah.
But we know that in the order of things, that Adam was created first and Eve was created later. And later in Genesis 2, God says, not as if like, oh man, I forgot something, but just as in a didactic way, it's not good for man to be alone. Yeah. So from the announcement of creation in Genesis 1, it always included the creation of a female. But she doesn't come along later.
Yeah.
So it's not until she's created that you have the totality of the human creation.
And just keep adding on to that. And Eve is fruition from Adam.
Yes.
Right. And then there will be fruition proceeding from them both.
Yes, exactly.
Just putting that out there.
Well, and because they can't carry out, he can't carry out the creation mandate without community.
Yeah, because God
Yes.
is imaging himself in
Yes,
that creation.
exactly.
And the fact that he is a rational being, rationality involves mind, will, purpose, reason. Once you have that, you relate. Right,
exactly.
You relate. You have a mind, you have a reason, you have a will, you have a purpose. And that is expressed in relationality. Relationality, mutuality.
And another of the communicable attributes would be morality.
Yeah.
God is a moral God.
Right.
And he created his image bearers to be moral beings. And to be moral means to have an innate sense of right and wrong as absolute categories.
Yeah. So from the part of God, obviously, he doesn't have a standard that he lives by. Going back to the first observation, that God is his being is his ultimate good.
Yes, exactly.
So he is oriented towards his own act of being, which is his own good.
Yeah. Well, and
himself.
And another difference, even as God's images or God's attributes are reflected in the image of man, another primary difference is God's attributes, as we've indicated, they are not only self-contained, but they're perfect.
They're perfect.
And by perfect, I want to use Jonathan Edwards' description or definition of perfect. That which cannot be diminished nor improved.
Absolutely. And that is why they have said that it exists in pure act.
Yes.
Because it's not rising, it's not becoming, it's not growing. It's in its full being and in its full actualization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he can never be any more holy than he is,
or better,
and he'll never be less holy than he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think another one that I kind of think about is our creativeness or God's creativeness.
Yes.
Right. I mean, God creates, and man has the attribute to be able to create. Now we create with what God has given us, as opposed to God creating out of nothing. Right?
Sure.
But yeah, that ability for men to create. I love it when men conspire together, right, in Genesis.
Yes.
To build the Tower of Babel. You know what I mean? We're going to reach God, right?
Yeah.
I love God's language there, because God's language there is actually like, man, like we got to come down and finish this, right? Like because in a way, God is like, you know what, they might do this, so the language that he uses there. So our ability to create.
I'm just going to add to that with creativity, to expand it a bit. The aesthetic part of man, our ability to create or appreciate, even in an artistic way.
Yeah.
So artistic expression, in a sense, is part of our reflecting the image of the Creator, holding in mind that in God all of these attributes exist in perfection.
Yeah.
But in man, they're not. It's not. But it's enough to display something of the Creator in man, in his created state. We're going to get, in a moment, we're going to get to corruption, but we want to see it in creation.
So we've spoken of rationality, relationality, morality, and now we're speaking of creativity. I want to call that God's image ability. That he has the ability to image himself, because that is, creation is a byproduct of that ability in God. And we too.
Yeah, I like that.
We have the ability to image ourselves, because the greatest creation of God's image is man, the crown of creation.
Right.
So then we are imaging the crown right, of creation, and it all goes back to the Creator and His image ability.
Yeah.
It all goes back to the ultimate good, God Himself.
And what's interesting is in Genesis, when in Genesis 2 especially, you see all of those divine attributes on display in Adam. When God brings the animals to him, Adam names them.
Names them, yeah.
Using the gift of language.
Yep.
And then when God creates a woman for him, then Adam pronounces this blessing on the woman in the same way that God announced after creating everything. He says, it is good. And then when he created man, it is very good. And then when God creates Eve and presents her to Adam, he gives this pronouncement and even a prophetic pronouncement. So we can see the image of God uncontaminated, not corrupt, on display in Adam, rendering sound judgment, doing that which God has called him to do, glorifying God and enjoying God's creation.
You know what I love about that in Genesis 2 is that even the institution of marriage, right, that is proclaimed there, it is Adam that's making that proclamation.
Yes, exactly.
It's not God.
No,
you know,
that's exactly that's the point. It's the image bearer reflecting
Blessing.
in purity,
the
blessing of being
which leads
created.
us before we move on from incorruption. It leads us to another attribute of God, His blessedness. He is ultimately blessed, and lives in perfect blessedness. And that's the word that I'm using in eternal fruition, in eternal blessedness. And that also gets imaged unto us.
Yes.
That when we create, when we work, when we produce, when we live and beget, that is also called blessed, a blessing, an image of the blessed God. A fruition at the creaturely level that images the fruition of God Himself. In His own attributes.
So now comes corruption. Now comes the fall. And I know it was discussed early in Protestant theology, the question of whether or not in the fall does man lose the image of God. And sometimes our Protestant forefathers are not as clear on that as they should. In other words, I think it's Calvin in the Institutes who basically says the image of God is lost, but then he goes on to describe it as being corrupt. So in the fall, we do not lose the image of God. But what happens is all of those attributes that are reflected in us are now corrupt. In other words, in the fall, it doesn't mean we stop being rational, although some parents would question the rationality of their children and others and others that we don't like. But man thinks. But the problem is we don't think as clearly and as consistently and as morally as we should. In fact, all of the attributes of God that are reflected in us, they, rather than holding together in an integrated way, they're almost functioning independently sometimes.
Fragmented.
Yeah, fragmented.
Disjointed.
Exactly. We become disjointed. And not only that, but they're striving for a different purpose.
So what we were saying about incorruption, the state prior to the fall, so man was ordered toward that ultimate good. And that was the binding principle in his integrated being.
Yeah, the integrity of our created state.
Right. So that disjointedness comes from now having been disconnected and cut off from that ultimate good, from that ultimate orientation.
Yeah.
So that when and I think that brings the idea of eschatology into the equation, that man created in the image of God was by nature, by creation, in the image of God oriented towards an eschatological ultimate good.
Yeah.
And now it says we have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, not in a static sense, certainly ontologically and functionally and mentally and in every regard that we are humans created in the image of God, but also in the eschatological sense of the eschatology that God ordained for us to have, which is heavenly glory and dwelling with him. We have been derailed from that path of glory unto glory.
Yeah, so now I guess the corruption of that is the eschatological corruption would be we seek eternity
In the city of men.
on our own terms. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
In the tower.
I was going to say that I like
Yeah.
I like to use the term of dependence and independence. God had created us, and as you mentioned, David, we were on the path to the glory He created us for, right? In our dependence in Him.
Yes.
But man in the garden chooses independence. Right? Like we choose independence, and now we're in a path.
Man chooses atheism for himself.
Yeah.
He chooses his own aseity.
That was but that was the temptation.
Yeah.
God knows that when you eat, you'll be like him. That was the allurement. That was
You can
the
strike
enticement.
out. You
Hey,
can be God.
we can be God.
Yeah.
Be divine.
Yeah. And that's what, like you said, derailed us.
And we get tricked into it because we're a good creation. We
Yes,
image
exactly.
God in mighty ways.
Yes.
And when we see the byproduct of our creation, we almost think we can make it.
Right.
As in the tower, we'll make it. This tower is
No, we
looking-
don't almost think we can.
Yeah, we
really
we're persuaded
delude
of-
ourselves
We
into
delude
thinking that we
ourselves.
can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at how the concept of eternity has been passed on even in literature and even in fairy tales. This idea of living forever. So whether it's tainted or whether it's attained according to the wrong thing, eating an apple will give you eternity or whatever, golden
Drinking
apple.
of the fountain of youth.
Yes, exactly. but that's the corruption of something that has
interesting.
that's given to us. This the writer of Ecclesiastes says he's put eternity in our breasts.
Yeah, that quest
Yeah.
for glory and immortality and permanence, right?
Yes.
It's the stuff of warriors of old and legends, right?
Yeah, so it becomes corrupt in so many ways, but it's there by design, by the design of the Creator. So what we try to do is circumvent the eternality that has been put in our breast. We try to circumvent what God has, that's what has,
And it
is the
leads
end
to
result,
a
I
toil,
guess.
it leads to a struggle.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
A
writer
wearying struggle.
the writer of Ecclesiastes calls it the miserable task.
Yeah.
Right? The miserable task. And that miserable task, it works in two ways. So in one way, it reminds us that we were created for something else, something greater, a greater glory. That is the good, or we could say it's a benevolent thing that God gives us this miserable task, because it leads us back to, hey, you're in the wrong path, right? But at the same time, I think that miserable task as well becomes the very thing that ultimately drives men to continue pursuing glory, right? In everything else but God.
Yeah, and see, and we were talking about this before, but because I'm going through Ecclesiastes as well, and when Solomon talks about vanity, and then he uses the term under the sun, and under the sun is really a broader theological, philosophical category. It's not just talking about everything that is physically beneath the sun, but it presupposes a vertical disconnection.
Yeah.
That we are not connected with Creator to the degree that we should be. And then because of that vertical disconnection, there's horizontal dysfunction.
And if I may add to that, Ken, that disconnection is not only metaphysically and psychologically, but it's also revelatory wise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because as we had mentioned in one of our previous programs, that first Adam received a covenant from God. And when we are seeking that ultimate end in ourselves, we have neglected to understand the revelation of God. and we have neglected to heed
Yes.
what the constraints that God has given us, or the boundaries that God has given us to have fruition and blessedness of Him, which is expressed as covenant. We are locked in the works covenant, and locked in the works covenant, we cannot move on to.
And but I guess part of that disconnection is that which is naturally revealed is either rejected, rebelled against, or
Suppressed.
resisted. Yeah, suppressed. We hold it down. So whether it's in the created order or even the things that we see horizontally, the sense of work.
Well, it's part of the lie that we believed in the garden.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? So we continue pursuing the same lie, believing the same story.
Yeah. And it's interesting in the book of Revelation as well. I think that's the dragon's greatest weapon. It's not the physical persecution against the saints, but it's the communication of a lie and branding according to the lie.
Yeah.
And seeking, and whatever that lie is, it's not a single lie, but it's a lie about, it's a lying perception about ultimacy.
It is single
and
in its
purpose.
essence.
Yes.
Because it says your ultimacy is bound within natural creation.
Yes.
With the first order of things.
Yeah, and your physical perception of things is what it really is. That's it. There's nothing beyond it. But to go back to in creation, we have been created to image God, to reflect Him. And so His communicated attributes allows us to function really as Meredith Klein calls us, vice regents within the created order. But in corruption, those same capacities are present, but instead of being pointing towards God vertically, it's now inclined.
Yeah.
Now
Curved
it's curved in so that we become really the means of determining ultimacy and purpose and glory. And it's our glory, our legacy, rather than His glory that we seek. And we are defining even our enjoyment along, on in the vertical things, the things that He's given us in creation. Yeah. But because we are disconnected from Him, we can't even enjoy that properly.
So ontologically, in other words, the capacities to reason, to relate, to exercise moral judgments is there functionally.
Functionally, it is there.
But it has been distorted when it comes to its ultimate end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the reason why Isaiah says that even our good deeds are bloody rags, right?
Exactly.
That's the reason why
that's good.
Ecclesiastes in chapter 3 talks about all the injustice under the sun, right? Why? Because everything's injustice.
Right.
It really, what he's saying is like nothing man does has righteousness in it.
Because now it's ordered unto himself, curved in on himself.
Yeah.
That's 666, right?
Yeah.
That's basically, you can never attain eschatological glory and blessedness.
But now here's where it gets a little dicey, because like you said, there's nothing under the sun that we can find ultimacy in. Our judgment is always going to be incomplete. It's always everything that we do because of out of our disconnection vertically is going to it's all going to be futile.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets dicey. It doesn't mean it can't be functional.
Sure.
And because to whatever degree it is functional, people will ascribe ultimacy to it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So in other words, because
it could be functionally good, earthly good, that is.
Or it could be it could be functionally good
and earthly good.
And earthly good.
Yeah.
In this situation, but in another situation, it could be openly, clearly inconsistent with what it should be, but because it was good over here, then we assume, well, it's good. So in other words, God,
give an example.
Because God Himself, as being sovereign, is still in control of the universe. there are two realities that we live with. The world in which we live is cursed.
Yeah.
But in this cursed creation, God has established enough order to function.
Yep.
And through it, he brings, and that's the second part of it, he brings us out of the futility of being disconnected and therefore dysfunctional to connecting us and allowing us to function. But it doesn't mean the world system as it is all right.
No, well, as a matter of fact, just to go back, and I mean to harp on the idea of covenant, but it is again through another covenant that God continues to relate to man in its ultimate decree unto glorification, and that is the Noahic covenant.
Yes,
in which God preserves,
Exactly.
in which God, continues the story of mankind.
Yes.
And there are certain things that are earthly good there,
and
that are functionally good.
And part of that covenantal that covenant that he makes after the flood is reflected in Ecclesiastes.
Yep.
He says there's a time for everything.
Yep.
And
That's
there's
exactly
a
right.
time for everything under the sun. For everything there is a season. And part of our corruption thinks that the season is an end in itself.
Yeah.
And we've been dealing with the whole pandemic over the last 2 years, and I hear people say we got to get back to normal. And I push back, and I'm not trying to be a stick in the mud or a wet blanket, but I think that language of humans assuming normalcy in a world that's moving towards a determined end is part of our arrogance.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's normal?
Sure.
If the world is moving towards, if God is working now, unfolding his covenant curses within the created order, then what's normal until we get home?
That's exactly,
Well,
yeah.
and I know what we mean. I know what we mean by it. I know what we mean by it.
I guess, and let me, because I've been trying to think of an example to these commentary that we have offered in terms of what is functionally and earthly good. Science and medicine, right, is earthly good.
Right.
And it can eradicate a virus. But at the end of the day, if science is ultimate,
Right.
then it becomes a curse.
Exactly.
Right? It becomes a curse.
And the same thing with
So
politics.
apply it now across the board.
Political power.
Yeah.
And this
Government.
this government,
Yeah.
because and Christians, especially when we think that there is such thing as a Christian nation and God is doing something through our nation, he's not doing anything different in our nation than he is in any other nation, because no nation is the kingdom of God.
Sure.
So we sometimes ascribe ultimacy to those temporal things because God has allowed it to be as such. He's allowed it to sustain itself for a particular purpose, for a particular season.
And that doesn't mean, if I just to hold on there to that thought, so it doesn't, maybe I just want to nuance it a little bit, that political science can be an earthly good.
Absolutely.
And lead to the better construction of a government. I may say that America may have some of those features that are more desirable, or somebody else may say not. But when that becomes ultimate,
and that's the point. That's the point. Whether it's a nation or a form of government,
right?
We raise it to a state of ultimacy when all it is functional. Look at the world power that was in place when Peter says, "Pray for Caesar."
That's right.
Pray for those who rule and those who govern. Absolutely. When Jesus says, "Give Caesar his taxes,"
and
he's not affirming Caesar as an individual, nor Rome as a nation.
Of course not. As a matter of fact, he's even calling it a beast.
Yes, yes.
Decrying it for the spiritual agenda from the dragon that it brings upon us.
And it's not just in those areas, but in every other area. Those areas in which God allows us to experience pleasure, because pleasure also
there's another one.
The ability to experience pleasure corresponds to
God,
the blessedness, that's within God.
At my right hand, there are pleasures forevermore.
Yes, yes. And so, in its corrupt sense, we don't our pleasure, our sense of pleasure is still there.
Yeah.
But we find pleasure in things that are not connected to the Creator, and it becomes an end in itself.
Yes. And it all goes back to the fall and to the aseity of men in thinking that we, unlike God, can be self-sufficient and simple.
Yes.
In other words, we are always derived and affected beings. We will always ultimately receive the gifts and the capacities for pleasure, and we will be affected by the environment and context in which that is done, right? But ultimately, we have been created to draw, derive, and be affected by God Himself.
Yes.
And that was the path of the image bearer.
Well, let's look at what happens in creation when Adam, at the end of Genesis 2, he sings this wonderful song about Eve. I call it the first rap song, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. You know, so he creates this beautiful statement about Eve, and at the end of chapter 2, it says, "And they were naked and not ashamed."
Mm-hmm.
They eat the fruit. What happens?
Yep.
They see one another, their eyes were open, and they saw that they were naked, and they were ashamed and covered themselves. So now, does that mean that they were blind before? No.
No.
It doesn't mean that they gained physical sight.
Yep.
But what happened is being disconnected vertically has distorted things horizontally. So it's not that they see for the first time, but they see differently.
Yeah.
And so they're seeing through the lens of their guilt.
Right.
And they know, seeing themselves in a way that they didn't see themselves when they were in union with God.
Because they got what they asked for.
They got what they asked for.
And they asked for more than they could chew, which was to know independently of God.
Exactly.
To have a say in their knowledge.
Yeah. Wow.
Impossible.
Well, listen, we want to pick up this conversation in our next session, but no, that helps flesh out a lot of what we mean about the attributes of God as they are revealed in Scripture and as they are reflected in us, both in creation and in corruption. And that's what paves the way for the next conversation that we'll have, and how do we fix this? Because obviously something is wrong. So we thank you for joining us here at Saints and Sinners Unplugged. Please let us know what you think about these conversations, and we look forward to joining you next time.